The wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a wounded beast, carrying with it the bite of winter and the promise of another unforgiving night. In the valley below, where the Dugan Ranch squatted like a dark stain against the snow, Clara Whitmore pressed her face against the frost-covered window and watched the storm clouds gather. It had been 2 years since she'd come west as Hank Duggan's bride. 2 years since her father had sealed her fate with a handshake and a promise of business partnerships back in Philadelphia. She'd been 19 then, full of romantic notions about frontier life and the rugged men who tamed it. Now, at 21, those illusions lay as shattered as the china cup Hank had thrown at her head that morning. The door slammed open, bringing with it a gust of frozen air and the man she'd learned to fear more than the wilderness itself. Hank Dugan stood silhouetted in the doorway, his bulk made larger by the heavy coat he wore. Even from across the room, she could smell the whiskey on him, could see the familiar glaze in his eyes that meant trouble. "Where's my supper?" he growled, kicking the door shut with his boot. Clara's hands trembled as she smoothed her patched dress. "It's on the stove, keeping warm. I didn't know when you'd be back from town." "That's your problem, woman. You don't know nothing." He shed his coat, letting it fall to the floor where she'd have to pick it up later. "Met Joe Patterson in town. Says he saw you talking to that traveling merchant last week." Her heart stuttered. "I only bought thread and—" The back of his hand caught her across the cheek, sending her stumbling against the rough wooden table. Stars burst behind her eyes as pain bloomed across her face. "You don't talk to no men without my say-so. You hear me?" Hank's voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper she'd come to dread more than his shouts. "You're mine, Clara. Bought and paid for, just like them cattle out there." She kept her eyes down, had learned that meeting his gaze when he was like this only made things worse. "Yes, Hank." "Yes, what?" "Yes, husband." He grunted, seemingly satisfied, and dropped into his chair at the head of the table. Clara moved mechanically, serving the stew she'd kept simmering all day, pouring coffee with hands that barely shook anymore. She'd gotten good at hiding the trembling, at making herself small and quiet. As Hank ate, he talked about his day, about the men he'd cheated at cards, the ranchers who owed him money, the shipment of rifles coming in next month that would make him rich. Clara stood by the stove, not daring to sit until he gave permission, and let his words wash over her like the wind outside. She thought about her life before, about the house in Philadelphia with its neat garden and her mother's piano in the parlor. Her mother had been dead 3 years now, and perhaps it was a mercy she hadn't lived to see what had become of her daughter. Clara's father had needed money after bad investments had nearly ruined him, and Hank Duggan had offered a solution, a marriage that would bring Western cattle money into the family business. "You ain't eating," Hank observed, his mouth full of stew. "I'm not hungry." "Wasteful." He pointed his spoon at her. "That's what you are. Wasteful and ungrateful. Another woman would be happy to have a roof over her head and a man to provide for her." Clara bit back the words that wanted to escape. Another woman might not have bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, might not flinch at her husband's footsteps, might not lie awake at night planning escape routes she'd never have the courage to take. The meal continued in relative silence, broken only by Hank's chewing and occasional grunt. Outside, the storm was building, and Clara could hear the shutters beginning to bang against the house. When Hank finally pushed his plate away and stood, she tensed. "I'm going to check on the horses," he announced. "This storm's going to be a bad one. When I get back, you better be ready to show me some appreciation for all I do for you." The door slammed behind him, and Clara sagged against the stove. She knew what appreciation meant in Hank's vocabulary, knew the particular violence that came with it. Her hand drifted to her ribs, still tender from last week when she'd been too slow bringing his boots. Through the window, she could barely make out Hank's figure heading toward the barn, already weaving from the whiskey. The storm was getting worse, the snow coming down so thick it was like a curtain between the house and the rest of the world. Something inside Clara suddenly snapped, like a rope that had been fraying for months finally giving way. She looked around the kitchen, at the pile of mending that never ended, at the blood stain on the floor she couldn't quite scrub out, at the life that was slowly killing her, and made a decision. Moving quickly, she grabbed her heaviest shawl and wrapped it around herself. She had no coat. Hank had sold hers last winter to pay a gambling debt, from the drawer where she kept her few possessions. She took the small cloth bag containing $2 silver, money she'd hidden away coin by coin from the household expenses. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She paused at the door, looking back at the house that had been her prison. In the distance, she could hear Hank cursing at the horses, his voice carrying on the wind. He'd be busy for a while, and then he'd likely stop at the tack room where he kept a bottle hidden. It might be an hour before he realized she was gone. Clara stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. Snow immediately began to coat her hair and shoulders. She had no real plan, no destination in mind. She only knew that she had to get away, that another night in that house would finally break whatever was left of her spirit. The ranch property stretched for miles in every direction, but she knew that to the north lay the mountain passes. It was dangerous terrain, especially in a storm, but it was also the direction Hank would least expect her to go. Everyone knew the mountains in winter could kill you just as surely as a bullet. But as Clara stumbled through the deepening snow, her thin boots already soaked through, she thought that freezing to death in the clean, honest cold might be preferable to the slow death she'd been dying in that house, at least in the mountains. She'd die free. Behind her, the lights of the ranch house grew dimmer, swallowed by the storm. Ahead lay only darkness and the unknown. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking, each step taking her further from the life she'd known and closer to whatever fate awaited her in the frozen wilderness. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face like tiny needles. Her feet were numb now, and she stumbled over hidden rocks and roots. But she didn't stop, didn't look back. In her mind, she could still hear Hank's voice, still feel his hands, and that was enough to drive her forward into the storm. As the night deepened and the cold began to seep into her bones, Clara Whitmore disappeared into the Colorado mountains, leaving behind only footprints that the snow would soon erase. Whether she was walking toward death or deliverance, she didn't know. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years, she was choosing her own path. The storm raged on, indifferent to the small figure struggling through it, indifferent to the desperation that had driven her into its embrace. In the morning, Hank Dugan would wake to find his wife gone, and his rage would shake the rafters. But by then, Clara would be beyond his reach, somewhere in the vast wilderness where the mountains kept their secrets and the snow covered all sins. Elijah Kane had learned to read the mountain weather like scripture. 20 years in these Colorado peaks had taught him when storms would blow through and when they'd hunker down for days. This one, he knew, was a killer. He'd seen its like before, the way the clouds stacked up like granite walls, the peculiar stillness before the wind came howling. He was checking his trap lines one last time before the worst of it hit, his horse picking carefully through the deepening snow. Most men would have headed back to shelter hours ago, but Elijah had lived alone so long that the storm's fury seemed almost companionable compared to the silence of his cabin. That's when he saw her, or what he thought at first was a deer collapsed in the snow. But deer didn't wear faded blue fabric, and they didn't have long dark hair spilling across the white ground like spilled ink. "Whoa, Moses," he murmured to his horse, swinging down from the saddle. The woman, for that's what she was, he could see now, lay curled on her side, her body drawn up tight against the cold. Snow had already begun to drift against her still form. Elijah knelt beside her, pulling off his glove to feel for a pulse at her throat. Her skin was ice cold, but there, faint as a whisper, he felt life still flickering. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then gathered her up in his arms. She weighed hardly nothing, like a bird made of bones and sorrow. "Come on now," he said, though she couldn't hear him. "Don't you go dying on my land. I got enough ghosts here already." Getting her onto Moses took some doing. Elijah ended up laying her across the saddle and walking alongside, one hand steadying her, the other leading the horse. The storm was worsening by the minute, and what should have been a 20-minute ride to his cabin stretched into an hour of fighting through winds that tried to knock them sideways. By the time they reached the cabin, Elijah's hands were numb and his legs felt like tree trunks. He carried the woman inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and laid her on the rug before the banked fire. In the lamplight, he could see her face properly for the first time, and something twisted in his chest, beneath the blue-white pallor of cold. Bruises marked her skin like violent flowers, purple and yellow across her cheekbone, darker marks on her throat. Her lips were split, and when he carefully removed the snow-sodden shawl, he could see more bruises disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. Lord Almighty. Elijah breathed. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize its signature, and this woman bore it like a map of suffering. He built up the fire until it roared, then faced a dilemma that would have been simple for any doctor, but was complicated for a man who'd lived alone for 7 years. Her clothes were soaked through and frozen stiff. She'd die if he left them on her. But propriety, what little of it existed in the wilderness, demanded respect. In the end, practicality won. Elijah fetched blankets from his bed and, with his eyes averted as much as possible, peeled away the frozen layers. He tried not to see the full extent of the bruising that covered her arms and ribs. Tried not to think about what kind of man would do this to a woman. He wrapped her in the blankets until only her face was visible. Then positioned her close to the fire. Her breathing was still too shallow, her skin too cold. Elijah had seen men die from exposure, knew how the cold could steal into a body and refuse to leave. He grabbed more blankets, building a nest around her. Then did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He lay down beside another human being. Just for warmth, he told the empty cabin, pulling the blankets over both of them. Nothing more than keeping you alive, ma'am. He kept his body carefully separate from hers, just close enough to share heat. The storm raged outside, shaking the cabin walls, but inside, there was only the crackle of fire and the gradual deepening of her breathing. Sometime in the night, she began to shiver, violent, whole-body tremors that meant life was fighting its way back. Elijah held the blankets tight around her, murmuring nonsense words like he would to a spooked horse. "That's it. Fight your way back. You're stronger than the cold. I can tell that much about you already." Dawn came pale and reluctant, the storm still blowing but with less fury. Elijah had dozed fitfully, waking every time the woman's breathing changed. Now, in the gray morning light, he saw her eyelids flutter. She came awake all at once, like a wild animal realizing it's trapped. Her body went rigid, and a sound, half sob, half scream, tore from her throat as she tried to scramble away. "Easy," Elijah said, holding up his hands and backing away from the blankets. "Easy now. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." Her eyes, brown as autumn earth, darted around the cabin, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The man sitting carefully distant from her, the blankets covering her. Her hand clutched at the blankets, and fresh panic flashed across her face. "Your clothes were frozen," Elijah explained, keeping his voice low and calm. "Would have killed you if I'd left them. They're drying by the fire there. I kept you covered, ma'am, just trying to save your life." She stared at him for a long moment, then seemed to realize he was telling the truth. Some of the wild fear left her eyes, replaced by a wariness that made him think of the wolves he sometimes saw in the high country. "Where?" The word came out as a croak. "My cabin, about 10 miles north of Beaver Creek. If you know the area. Found you in the snow yesterday evening." He gestured toward the window where snow still fell steadily. "Storm's not done yet. You picked a bad night to be out walking." Her face crumpled then, and she turned away, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Elijah could see her shoulders shaking, but no sound came. He'd seen men cry after battles, knew sometimes the body needed to let out what the heart couldn't hold. So he busied himself with practical things, stoking the fire, heating water for tea, finding clothes she could wear. From his trunk, he pulled out a shirt and trousers that had belonged to him 20 pounds and another lifetime ago. They'd swamp her, but they were clean and dry. He also found thick wool socks and set them all on a chair within her reach. "I'll step outside," he said. "Give you privacy to dress. There's hot water in the kettle if you want to wash, and I'll have some food ready when you're done." He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the storm, giving her the dignity of solitude. The cold hit him like a fist, but he welcomed it after the strange intimacy of the night. He'd grown used to his isolation, built walls around himself as solid as the mountains. Now this battered woman had appeared like something out of a fever dream, bringing the outside world crashing into his carefully ordered existence. When enough time had passed, he knocked on his own door, absurdity that almost made him smile. "Ma'am, you decent?" "Yes." Her voice was stronger now, though still rough. She sat by the fire, drowning in his clothes, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. In the morning light, he could better see the fine bones of her face, the kind of beauty that bruises couldn't quite hide. She held a cup of tea in both hands, like it was an anchor keeping her steady. "Thank you," she said without looking at him. For saving me. Couldn't very well leave you to freeze." Elijah moved to the stove, busying himself with breakfast. "Though I got to ask, what were you doing out there? That wasn't no evening stroll weather." Her hands tightened on the cup. I had to leave. Had to get away." The Bruises told their own story, so Elijah didn't push. Instead, he cooked. Biscuits and gravy, thick slices of bacon, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. He set a plate before her and was gratified to see her eat, slowly at first, then with increasing appetite. "I'm Elijah Kane," he offered when she'd finished most of her meal. She hesitated. Then, "Clara Whitmore." Another pause. "Clara Dugan. I suppose, though I'd rather forget that name." Duggan. Elijah knew of Hank Duggan by reputation, a mean drunk who'd gotten rich selling guns and didn't much care who bought them. The kind of man who'd put bruises on a woman and call it his right. "You running from him?" She nodded, finally meeting his eyes. "He'll come looking. He doesn't like losing what he considers his property." "Let him come," Elijah said quietly. "Man's got to be stupid or desperate to chase someone into these mountains during a storm." "He's both." Clara set down her cup with shaking hands. "I shouldn't have come here. I've brought trouble to your door." "Ma'am, Clara, I've lived in these mountains for 7 years. Trouble's about the only visitor I get anymore." He gestured around the cabin. "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes and you figure out where you're going. Nobody's going to hurt you here." She studied him then, really looked at him for the first time. Elijah knew what she saw, a man in his 30s, worn older by sun and solitude. Dark hair gone early gray at the temples, hands scarred from work and older violence. He wondered what conclusions she was drawing, what she thought of finding herself alone with another stranger. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why help me?" It was a fair question, one Elijah wasn't sure he could answer. Maybe because he recognized something in her eyes, the look of someone who'd lost everything and was trying to find a reason to keep going. Maybe because the mountains had taught him that sometimes you saved what you could from the storm and asked questions later. Because it was the right thing, he said simply. "Don't need more reason than that." Clara nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace settled. Two damaged souls, brought together by chance and storm, beginning the careful dance of trust. Neither of them knew yet that this was just the beginning, that the storm outside was nothing compared to what was coming. But for now, there was warmth and safety, and the possibility, thin as spring ice, that they might help each other heal. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in a world bounded by log walls and frosted windows. By the 3rd evening, Clara had begun to lose the hunted look that had marked her first hours in the cabin. She sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt of Elijah's with neat, precise stitches. while he worked on repairing a broken trap at the table. "You don't have to do that," he said for the third time, gesturing at the mending pile she'd commandeered. "I need to be useful." She replied without looking up. "I can't just sit here eating your food and burning your wood without giving something back." Elijah watched her work, noting the practiced efficiency of her movements. "You did this a lot back before?" Her hands stilled for a moment. "Among other things, Hank believed a wife should earn her keep." The bitter twist she gave the words made them sound like a curse. They'd been dancing around her past for days. Clara offering fragments when the silence grew too heavy. Elijah careful not to push. But tonight, with the wind finally dying outside and the familiar walls seeming to press closer, something shifted. "I was 17 when my father first brought Hank to dinner," Clara said suddenly. "He seemed charming then. Brought me flowers, talked about building an empire out west. I was young enough to think it sounded romantic." She set down the mending and stared into the fire. "My mother had just died. Consumption. Father was drowning in debt from her medical bills and bad investments. When Hank offered to buy into the family business as part of a marriage arrangement, it seemed like salvation. You didn't have a choice," Elijah said quietly. "No woman has choices. Mr. Kane, we just have different cages." She picked up the sewing again, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her voice. "The first time he hit me was on our wedding night. I'd cried because I missed my mother. He said I was ungrateful." Elijah's hands tightened on the trap he was fixing, the metal biting into his palms. He'd known men like Hank Duggan in the war, men who confused fear with respect, who needed to break things to feel whole. "It got worse when we came west," Clara continued. "No family to notice the bruises, no neighbors close enough to hear. He drank more, got meaner, started talking about me like I was livestock. 'Gotta break a filly, right?' he'd say. "Clara," Elijah started, but she shook her head. "I need to say it. Need someone to know." She met his eyes across the dim cabin. "I tried to be good, tried to be what he wanted, but nothing was ever enough. The food was too cold or too hot. I looked at him wrong or didn't look at him at all. I breathed too loud." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Do you know what it's like to measure your breaths, Mr. Kane? To calculate every movement, every word, trying to figure out which version of yourself might not trigger a fist?" "No," Elijah said honestly. "But I know what it's like to carry weight that's crushing you. Different kind, maybe, but heavy all the same." Clara studied him then, seeing past the careful distance he maintained. "You've known loss." It wasn't a question, but Elijah found himself answering anyway. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of being stormbound, or maybe he recognized something in her that called to his own grief. Had a wife once, Mary, and a daughter, Rose. She was 4 years old, liked to put wildflowers in her hair and pretend she was a fairy princess. The words came slowly, dragged up from depths he usually kept sealed. "We had a small farm down in the valley. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." He stood abruptly, moving to the window where the last light was fading. "I was in town getting supplies. Comanche raiding party hit while I was gone. They were both dead when I got back. The house was burning." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding. Clara rose and moved to stand beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth. "How do you bear it?" she asked softly. "Some days I don't." He pressed his palm against the cold glass. "Came up here to die, if I'm honest. Figured the mountains would do what I couldn't, but they didn't kill me. And after a while, I stopped wanting them to. Started building this place, learning the land. It's not living exactly, but it's not dying either." "Purgatory," Clara whispered. "Maybe, or maybe just what we do when we're not ready for either heaven or hell." She turned to look at him fully then, and he was struck again by the strength hidden beneath the bruises. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do next. I can't go back, but I don't know how to go forward. I've never been allowed to make my own choices." "So start small," Elijah suggested. "What do you want right now, this moment?" Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I want to learn to shoot. You said it earlier, so I can protect myself. I want to never be helpless again. I can teach you that. And I want— She hesitated, color rising in her cheeks. I want to sit by the fire and talk to someone who sees me as a person, not property. I want to remember what that feels like. So that's what they did. As darkness fell complete outside, they returned to their places by the fire, but the careful distance between them had shrunk. Clara told him about Philadelphia, about the books she'd loved and the dreams she'd had before Hank. Elijah found himself sharing memories he'd locked away. Mary's laugh, Rose's stubborn streak, the plans they'd made for expanding the farm. She would have liked you, he said suddenly, surprising himself. Mary, she had a soft spot for fighters, even when they didn't know they were fighting. Clara smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, hinting at the woman she might have been in another life. I think I would have liked her too. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm's fury had finally spent itself, leaving an expectant quiet in its wake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions about where Clara would go, how to handle Hank when he inevitably came looking. But tonight, they had this: warmth, safety, and the tentative connection between two souls who understood loss. Elijah, Clara said as the clock neared midnight. Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for treating me like I matter. You do matter, he said simply. Don't let anyone tell you different, including yourself. She reached out then, briefly touching his hand where it rested on his knee. It was the first voluntary contact she'd initiated, and Elijah felt it like a spark jumping between them. Not desire, not yet, but possibility. The potential for something neither of them was ready to name. I should sleep, Clara said, withdrawing her hand, but not the warmth it had left behind. Take the bed, Elijah offered as he had each night. I'm fine by the fire. You've slept on the floor for 3 nights. Your back must be aching. I've slept in worse places. She stood, hesitating. We could. That is, the bed is large enough, with a blanket between, for propriety. Elijah looked up at her, reading the fear and trust warring in her expression. It wasn't an invitation to anything beyond sleep, just a recognition that they were both adults who could share space without it meaning more than comfort. If you're certain, he said carefully. I'm trying to be certain about something. This seems like a good place to start. So they prepared for bed with the awkwardness of strangers learning to trust. A thick blanket down the middle of the bed, each on their own side, fully clothed. Clara curled up small, her back to him, while Elijah lay rigid, hyper-aware of every breath and movement. I have nightmares, she warned softly in the darkness. So do I. What do you dream about? Fire, screaming, getting there too late. He paused. You? Footsteps, doors slamming, not being able to run fast enough. They lay in silence, each carrying their own darkness. Then Clara turned slightly, just enough to see his profile in the moonlight filtering through the window. Maybe tonight we'll dream of something else, she said. Maybe, Elijah agreed. And perhaps it was the talking, or the storm's passing, or simply the comfort of not being alone. But when sleep finally came, it was deeper than either had known in years. No nightmares chased them through the dark hours. No ghosts whispered accusations. Just 2 wounded people finding a moment's peace in the simple act of human connection. When dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, they woke to find the blanket barrier had shifted in the night. Not crossed, but pushed aside just enough that their hands rested near each other on the mattress. Close enough to touch if either chose to reach out. Neither moved to widen the gap. Spring came slowly to the mountains, creeping up the valleys like a cautious animal. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the air carried hints of growing things. Clara had been at the cabin for 6 weeks, and the rhythms of this isolated life had become as natural as breathing. Hold it steady, Elijah instructed. standing behind her as she aimed the rifle at a target he'd set up, a piece of bark marked with charcoal. "Don't fight the weight. Let it become part of your arm." Clara squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out across the clearing. The bullet struck just left of center, and she lowered the rifle with a satisfied nod. "Better," she said, "though I still pull left when I'm thinking too hard. You're thinking about not missing instead of thinking about hitting." Elijah moved beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "There's a difference." She'd grown comfortable with his nearness over the weeks, the careful distance between them shrinking by degrees. He taught her to shoot, to read tracks in the mud, to tell which plants would heal and which would harm. In return, she'd brought order to his chaos, mending clothes he'd have thrown away, organizing supplies he'd kept in haphazard piles, cooking meals that were more than just sustenance. "Again," Clara said, raising the rifle. This time when she fired, the bark splintered dead center. Elijah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Mary was a good shot too. Said it was just mathematics, wind speed, distance, trajectory. Made it sound simple as baking bread. Clara had learned to treasure these mentions of his wife, understanding them as the gifts they were. Each shared memory was a brick removed from the wall he'd built around himself. They were walking back to the cabin, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, when Clara spotted the deer, a doe, standing perfectly still at the forest edge, watching them with liquid eyes. Without thinking, Clara reached for Elijah's hand, wanting to share the moment. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. They'd touched before, helping each other over rough ground, passing tools and dishes. But this was different. This was wanting connection for its own sake. Elijah didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers intertwined with hers, calloused and warm. They stood that way, watching the deer until it bounded away, but neither moved to break the contact. "Clara," Elijah began, his voice rougher than usual. "I know," she said softly. "I know all the reasons why this is complicated." They'd been dancing around it for weeks. The growing attraction, the way their eyes lingered, how the cabin felt empty when the other stepped outside. But knowing something existed and acknowledging it were different things entirely. "You're still married," Elijah said, though the words seemed to pain him. "And you've been through—" "Don't." Clara turned to face him, keeping hold of his hand. "Don't tell me what I've been through. I know better than anyone. But I also know how I feel when you look at me. Like I'm not broken. Like I'm worth something." "You are worth everything," Elijah said fiercely. "That's never been in question." "Then why do we keep pretending?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I've spent 3 years with a man who took what he wanted. Now I'm with a man who won't take what's freely offered. Because you deserve better than—" Clara silenced him by pressing her free hand to his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palm. "What I deserve is the chance to choose. For once in my life, Elijah, let me choose." The forest seemed to hold its breath as they stood there, poised on the edge of something irreversible. Then Elijah brought his free hand up to cup her face, his thumb ghosting over her cheekbone where the last of the bruises had faded to memory. "Are you certain?" he asked. Instead of answering with words, Clara rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. Then Elijah's arm came around her waist, drawing her against him, and tentative became certain. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Clara saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I haven't—" Elijah started, then stopped. 7 years is a long time. 3 years of marriage, and I've never been kissed like that," Clara admitted. "Like I was precious. Like I mattered." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the air between them charged with new possibility. But as they crested the rise that brought the cabin into view, Elijah suddenly stopped, his body tensing. "What is it?" Clara asked, then followed his gaze. Fresh horse tracks led to the cabin, and the door stood slightly ajar, not how they'd left it. "Stay here," Elijah said, releasing her hand and checking his revolver. No. Clara raised the rifle she'd been carrying. We go together. He looked like he wanted to argue, but saw the determination in her eyes. They approached the cabin cautiously, Elijah pushing the door open with his boot while Clara covered him. The cabin was empty, but someone had been there. Things were moved, disturbed. A message had been carved into the table's surface with a knife. Bring her back or burn. Clara's hands trembled as she lowered the rifle. Hank, or his men, they've found us. Elijah examined the tracks more closely. 2 riders. They left heading east, probably back to report. He turned to Clara, his face grim. We need to leave, now. No. The word came out stronger than Clara felt. I'm tired of running, tired of letting him dictate my life. Clara, be reasonable. He'll come back with more men. Then we'll be ready. She moved to the window, looking out at the land she'd come to love. This is your home, Elijah, and for the first time in my life, somewhere feels like my home too. I won't let him take that away. Elijah crossed to her, turning her to face him. I can't lose you, not when I just... He stopped, struggling with words that had been buried too long. Not when I'm just starting to feel alive again. You won't lose me. Clara reached up to touch his face. But I need to face this. I need to stop being afraid. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Elijah showed Clara defensive positions around the cabin, escape routes through the forest. They loaded weapons, stored water, prepared for siege. As night fell, they worked by lamplight, side by side, not talking about what might come. Finally, exhausted, they stopped. The cabin was as ready as it could be. Clara stood by the stove, heating water for tea, when Elijah came up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. I'm sorry, he murmured into her hair. Sorry you have to face this. Sorry I can't make it go away. Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling safer than she had in years despite the danger approaching. I'm not sorry. If I hadn't run that night, I'd never have found you, never have found myself. He turned her in his arms, and this time when they kissed, it was with the desperate edge of people who knew tomorrow wasn't promised. Clara's hands tangled in his hair, holding him close, trying to memorize the feeling. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. Clara, Elijah breathed, resting his forehead against hers. I know, she whispered. I know we should wait, should be proper, should figure out the legal matters first. But I've spent my whole life doing what I should. Tonight, I want what I want. And what do you want? You. This. Us. She met his eyes, unflinching. I want to choose love instead of fear. I want to feel alive. I want to know what it's like to be with a man who sees me as an equal, not property. Elijah studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or pressure, finding none. He made his own choice. He kissed her again, deeper this time, then took her hand and led her to their bed, not with the possessive grab of ownership, but with the gentle guidance of partnership. What followed was a revelation for Clara. Where Hank had taken, Elijah gave. Where there had been pain, there was tenderness. Where she had learned to disappear inside herself, she now learned to be present, to feel, to participate as an equal in the ancient dance of desire. Afterward, they lay entwined, Clara's head on Elijah's chest, listening to his heartbeat. The lamp burned low, casting golden light over their bare shoulders. No regrets? Elijah asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. None, Clara said firmly. Whatever happens tomorrow, we have tonight. We have this. I love you, he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him. I didn't think I'd ever say that again, but I do. I love your strength, your courage, the way you've brought life back to this place. To me. Clara lifted her head to look at him, tears pricking her eyes. I love you too, not because you saved me, but because you helped me save myself. They made love again as the night deepened, slower this time, memorizing each touch and whisper. Outside, clouds gathered, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, two hearts that had been broken learned they could still beat as one. When dawn broke gray and heavy, they were still awake, holding each other close. Both knew that Hank would come, that violence would follow, that their fragile peace would be tested. But they also knew they would face it together. No matter what happens, Elijah said as the first drops of rain hit the windows, "This was worth it. You were worth it." Clara kissed him once more, pouring all her love and determination into the gesture. "We both were, and we're going to survive this, Elijah. We're going to win, because now we have something to fight for." Thunder rolled across the mountains, heralding the storm's arrival. But in each other's arms, Clara and Elijah had already weathered the worst. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had learned to face everything, together. The news came with Marcus Wheeler, the trapper who occasionally traded with Elijah. He arrived on a lathered horse 3 days after they'd found the carved threat, his weathered face grim beneath his beard. "Duggan's offering $500 to anyone who brings his wife back," Marcus said, accepting the coffee Clara handed him. "Got men combing every trail from here to Denver. Says she stole from him when she ran." "Stole?" Clara's voice was bitter. "The only thing I took was myself." Marcus glanced between them, taking in the way they stood close, the protective angle of Elijah's body. "Figured as much. Also figured I should warn you. He's hired the Coulter brothers, bounty hunters out of Amarillo, mean as rattlesnakes and twice as dangerous." Elijah's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the Coulters, 3 brothers who'd track anyone for the right price, and weren't particular about whether they brought them back breathing. "When?" Elijah asked. "They rode out yesterday. If they're smart about the trails, you got maybe 2 days." Marcus set down his cup. "There's more. Duggan's been talking to Judge Harriman down in Culver City, trying to get papers saying Clara's not of sound mind, that she needs to be returned for her own safety." "That's absurd," Clara protested. "Maybe so, but Harriman owes Duggan money. A lot of people do." Marcus stood to leave. "You could run, head north to Wyoming territory. I know folks who could help you disappear." After Marcus left, Clara stood at the window, watching his figure disappear into the forest. "He's right. We should run. This is my fight, not yours." Elijah came up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Our fight. I thought we settled that. You could die because of me." "I was already dead," he said quietly. "You brought me back to life. If that life's shorter but means something, then it's a fair trade." Clara turned in his arms, searching his face. "I won't be the reason for another grave on this mountain. Elijah, I couldn't bear it. Then we won't give them one." He framed her face with his hands. "We're going to be smart about this. Use the land to our advantage. Make them come to us on our terms." They spent the day refining their defenses. Elijah showed Clara how to use the terrain, where to position herself for the best coverage. They cached weapons and ammunition at strategic points, prepared fallback positions, discussed contingencies until their voices were hoarse. That night, as they lay in bed, Clara traced the scars on Elijah's chest, old wounds from his war days. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "About Mary." Elijah was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she had hair like sunlight, used to wear it in a braid that hung to her waist. Rose would try to copy it, but her little fingers couldn't manage the weave. "How did you meet?" "Her father's farm neighbored ours. I was 16, thought I knew everything. She was 14 and actually did know everything, or at least more than me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Took me 3 years to work up the courage to court her proper. Her father thought I was too wild, but Mary saw something worth salvaging." Clara pressed a kiss to one of the scars. "She was right. I wasn't there when they needed me," Elijah said, the words raw. "I think about that every day. If I'd stayed home, if I'd been faster getting back, you'd likely be dead too." Clara propped herself up on an elbow. "And I'd be dead in the snow. Or worse, back with Hank. Our pain brought us together. Elijah, that has to count for something." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. It counts for everything. The next morning brought a late spring snow, fat flakes drifting down like ash. Elijah saw it as a blessing. Tracks would be visible. Approach routes limited. They went about their morning routine, trying to maintain normalcy despite the tension coiling tighter with each passing hour. Clara was bringing in firewood when she saw them, 2 riders picking their way up the valley trail. Her whistle brought Elijah running. "Just 2, he said, studying them through his field glass. "Could be scouts, or could be Hank thinks that's all he needs." Clara checked the load on her rifle. "Either way, they're not taking me back." The riders stopped just out of rifle range. One dismounted, walking forward with his hands visible but near his guns. He was a lean man with dead eyes and a face like tanned leather. "Kane," he called. "Jake Coulter, here to talk." "Talk from there." Elijah called back. "Fair enough." Coulter spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Duggan wants his wife back. Willing to pay you for your trouble. Say $100 for feeding and sheltering her. No questions asked. No hard feelings." "Not for sale," Clara called out, stepping into view with her rifle ready. Coulter's eyes fixed on her, taking in the weapon, the steady stance. "Ma'am, your husband's worried sick. Says you haven't been right in the head since you lost the baby." Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. "There was no baby. Just lies to cover the beatings." "That's not how he tells it." Coulter's voice was oil smooth. "Got a doctor willing to testify about your delicate condition. Judge already signed papers. You come peaceful-like. Nobody gets hurt." "The lady said no," Elijah stated. "Now get off my land." Coulter studied them for a long moment. "This ain't over. Duggan's got legal right to his wife. You're harboring a fugitive. Kane, that makes you fair game too. Then I guess we know where we stand." The bounty hunter remounted, touching his hat brim mockingly. "Be seeing you real soon." After they rode off, Clara sagged against the cabin wall. "A doctor. He's got a doctor lying for him." "Money buys a lot of lies," Elijah said grimly. "But it doesn't buy the truth. And the truth is, you're not going back." That afternoon, they heard from another unexpected source. Sarah Morrison, the doctor's wife from Culver City, arrived in a buggy with her teenage son driving. Clara had met her once at the general store, remembered her kind eyes and gentle manner. "Mrs. Duggan, Clara," Sarah said, climbing down despite Elijah's wariness. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I had to come." "Why?" Clara asked. Sarah reached into her bag, producing a leather folder. "Because what's happening isn't right. My husband's been documenting injuries on women for years. Bruises, breaks. Worse. Never could do anything about it legally, but he kept records." She opened the folder, revealing pages of notes. "Your name's in here. 3 visits over 2 years. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder. Injuries consistent with repeated assault. All dated and witnessed." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He wrote it down. Every word. Said someday it might matter." Sarah pressed the folder into Clara's hands. "There's also a letter from me and 5 other women in town. We've all seen what Hank Duggan is. Any judge who looks at this honest will know the truth." "This could make all the difference," Elijah said. "But you're taking a risk bringing it here." "Some risks are worth taking." Sarah looked at Clara. "You're not alone. Remember that. There are those of us who see, who know, who'll speak up when it counts." After Sarah left, Clara clutched the folder like a lifeline. Evidence, real evidence. It's a weapon as powerful as any gun. Elijah agreed. "But we still need to get it to an honest judge. Harriman won't care what it says." Then we go over his head. "The territorial court in Denver—" Her words were cut off by a rifle shot that shattered the window. Clara hit the floor, Elijah covering her with his body as more shots followed. "They're back," he growled. And done talking, they crawled to their prepared positions. Through the broken window, Clara could see riders, 5 of them now, spreading out to surround the cabin. "Surrender the woman! Kane!" That was Hank's voice, slurred with drink but vicious as ever. She's my legal wife. You got no right to her. I've got the right of human decency. Elijah shouted back, That trumps your papers. The answer was more gunfire. Clara and Elijah returned fire, their practice sessions paying off. Clara's shot sent one rider tumbling from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Elijah's rifle boomed, and another horse screamed and bolted. The barn, Clara said, spotting movement. They're trying to flank us. They shifted position, using the cabin's prepared gun ports. The battle raged as the afternoon wore on, neither side able to gain clear advantage. The attackers had numbers, but Clara and Elijah had cover and preparation. As dusk approached, Hank's voice rang out again. I'll burn you out, Cain, both of you. Try it, Elijah muttered. But Clara heard the worry. Fire was their weakness. The cabin would burn fast once lit. Then, distant but growing closer, came the sound of many horses. Clara's heart sank. Reinforcements? But the riders who emerged from the forest wore badges, a sheriff's posse from Culver City, led by Sheriff Tom Watson, one of the few lawmen Duggan couldn't buy. That's enough, Watson bellowed. Everyone drop your weapons. The Coulter brothers hesitated, but surrounded and outgunned, they complied. Hank, drunk and furious, had to be wrestled from his horse. Mrs. Morrison reached me with some interesting documents. Watson told Clara and Elijah as his men secured the attackers, along with a petition from half the women in 3 towns saying Clara Dugan should be granted protection from her husband. You can't do this, Hank raged. She's my wife, my property. A wife, not a slave, Watson said coldly. And there's enough evidence here to bring charges of assault, attempted murder, and about 6 other things. You'll be lucky if you don't hang Duggan. As they led Hank away, still cursing and threatening, he twisted to look back at Clara. You're nothing without me, nothing. Clara stepped forward, back straight, rifle still in her hands. I'm everything without you, and I'm finally free to find out what that means. The sheriff tipped his hat to them. There'll be a hearing. Make it all legal, but I don't think you'll have any more trouble from him, not where he's going. As the posse disappeared into the gathering darkness, Clara turned to Elijah. The danger was past. The immediate threat ended. But now came new questions. What happened next when the crisis that had brought them together was resolved? Elijah seemed to read her thoughts. This doesn't change anything between us, not for me, nor me, Clara said softly. But I need to do this right. Get the marriage dissolved legally. Stand on my own feet. Prove to myself I can. I understand. He gathered her into his arms. I'll wait, however long it takes. Clara rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady. Not too long. I hope we've both waited long enough for happiness. As night fell over the mountains, they stood together in their battered but unbroken cabin. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer threatening. They had fought for their right to choose, and won. Now came the harder battle, building a life together on the foundation of that freedom. But for tonight, it was enough to hold each other and know they had survived. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices. Tonight, they were simply 2 people who had found love in the most unlikely place, and refused to let it go. The gunfight erupted with sudden violence on a cold March morning. Hank had somehow posted bail and gathered new men, desperate types who do anything for money. They came at dawn, thinking to catch Clara and Elijah sleeping, but the mountain had taught them vigilance. Clara spotted the riders from her watch position and fired the warning shot that saved their lives. Within seconds, bullets were flying, splinters of wood exploding from the cabin walls. The west side, Elijah shouted, returning fire through a gun port. They're trying to circle. Clara moved swiftly to cover the flank, her rifle steady despite her racing heart. She'd grown stronger these past weeks, steadier. When she squeezed the trigger, a man cried out and fell from his horse. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Elijah fought like a man possessed, protecting not just Clara, but the life they'd started building together. His rifle never seemed to miss, his movements economical and deadly. Then Clara saw him, Hank, creeping along the tree line, trying to get close enough to throw something. Fire! He had a torch! Elijah! She screamed, but her warning came a heartbeat too late. One of Hank's men, taking advantage of the distraction, got off a clear shot. Elijah grunted and staggered, blood blooming across his shirt. No! Clara's world narrowed to a single point of rage. She swung her rifle toward the shooter, but Hank was already moving, the torch arcing through the air toward the cabin's dry wood roof. Time seemed to slow. Clara made her choice. Instead of shooting at the torch, she aimed at the man who'd become her nightmare. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Hank Duggan spun and fell, the torch dropping harmlessly into the snow. Clara! Elijah's voice was weak. He'd slumped against the wall, pressing his hand to his side where blood seeped between his fingers. The remaining attackers, seeing their employer fall and facing Clara's deadly accuracy, broke and ran. She barely noticed, dropping her rifle and rushing to Elijah. "Let me see," she demanded, pulling his hand away. The wound was bad but not immediately fatal. The bullet had caught him in the side, possibly cracking ribs but missing vital organs. "You shot him," Elijah breathed, his eyes glazed with pain and something like awe. "You chose to save the cabin over stopping him." "I chose to end it," Clara corrected, already tearing strips from her petticoat for bandages. "And you're not dying on me. Elijah Kane, we've come too far for that." She worked with desperate efficiency, packing the wound, binding it tight. All those injuries Hank had given her had taught her something about field medicine. Elijah's face was pale, but his breathing steadied under her care. "We need to get you to town," she said. "To a real doctor." "In a minute." He caught her bloody hand. "Is he dead?" Clara looked through the window to where Hank lay motionless in the reddening snow. "Yes." "How do you feel?" She considered the question, waiting for guilt or regret to come. Instead, there was only a vast relief, like a chain breaking. Free, finally. Truly free. Elijah managed a weak smile. "Good. Now maybe you could get me that doctor." The ride to Culver City was a nightmare of its own. Clara had to get Elijah onto Moses, then hold him steady while leading the horse down treacherous mountain paths. He drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about Mary and Rose, about Clara, about home. "Stay with me," she kept saying. "You promised to wait for me, remember? Can't break that promise now." By the time they reached the edge of town, a crowd had gathered. Word of the gunfight had already spread. Some of Hank's surviving men had talked. Sheriff Watson met them, taking in Clara's blood-soaked dress and Elijah's pallor. "Get Doc Morrison," he ordered someone. Then, to Clara, "Hank Duggan? Dead. I shot him." She met his eyes squarely. "He was trying to burn us out. He'd already shot Elijah. Self-defense, then." Watson helped her get Elijah down from the horse. "Clear as day, given the circumstances." "Doctor." Morrison worked on Elijah in his surgery while Clara waited outside, pacing like a caged animal. Sarah Morrison sat with her, not speaking, just offering silent support. The other women from town trickled in, the seamstress, the baker's wife, the school teacher. They formed a protective circle around Clara, these women who understood survival. "He's strong," Sarah said finally. "And he has something to live for." After what felt like days. "Doctor," Morrison emerged, rolling down his sleeves. "The bullet's out. He lost blood, and there's always risk of infection. But if he rests and lets himself heal, he should recover fully." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Can I see him? He's asking for you." Elijah was pale against the white sheets, but his eyes were clear when she entered. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey yourself." She took his hand, careful of the bandages. "You scared me." "Sorry, didn't mean to get shot." He squeezed her fingers weakly. "Heard you carried me down the mountain. You'd have done the same." "Clara," his voice turned serious. "What happens now? With Hank gone, you're truly free. You could go anywhere, do anything." She understood what he was really asking. Without the danger binding them, would she stay? Was what they had real, or just two desperate people clinging together in a storm? Clara leaned down and kissed him gently. What happens now is you heal. Then we go home, both of us, and we build the life we talked about. Unless you've changed your mind? Never. The word came out fierce despite his weakness. Just wanted to give you the choice. I made my choice that night in the snow when I ran. Every day since has just confirmed it. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. I love you, Elijah. Not because you saved me, not because we survived together, but because of who you are, who we are together. Marry me, he said suddenly. When I can stand up proper to do it right, marry me? Yes. No hesitation. No doubt. Yes, I'll marry you. The trial, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, with witness testimony, doctor, Morrison's medical records, and the evidence of the attack itself. The territorial judge took less than an hour to rule Hank Duggan's death a clear case of self-defense. He also posthumously charged Duggan with assault, attempted murder, and various other crimes, clearing Clara's name completely. More importantly, he granted the dissolution of Clara's marriage based on extreme cruelty and abuse. She walked out of the courthouse truly free for the first time in her adult life. Elijah was waiting on the steps, still moving carefully but upright and strong. How does it feel? Like the first day of spring, Clara said, taking his arm. Like anything is possible. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the cabin. Marcus Wheeler stood as witness along with Sarah Morrison. Clara wore a new dress she'd made herself, pale blue like the mountain sky, and wildflowers in her hair. Elijah had trimmed his beard and put on his best shirt, looking younger than his years. Do you, Clara, take this man to be your husband? The circuit preacher asked. I do, Clara said, her voice carrying strong and clear. Of my own free will and choice. The preacher smiled at the addition. And do you, Elijah, take this woman to be your wife? I do, with gratitude for the gift of a second chance at love. When they kissed, it was with the knowledge of all they'd survived to reach this moment. The mountains stood witness. The same peaks that had seen Clara's desperate flight now watching her choose her future. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, rebuilt stronger after the battle, Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder. The word still felt new. Wonderful. Husband. Chosen. Not imposed. Partner. Not owner. No regrets? Elijah asked, echoing his question from months before. Only one, Clara said, that Mary and Rose couldn't be here to see you happy again. He was quiet for a long moment. I think they know, and I think they'd approve. He kissed the top of her head. You've given me back my life. Clara, my ability to hope. We gave each other that, she corrected, and now we have the rest of our lives to make the most of it. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, the desperate flight into a killing storm. All of it had led to this moment, this man, this life she'd claimed for herself. She'd left Hank's ranch as property. She'd returned to town as evidence in a trial, but here, in this cabin with this man who saw her as an equal, she was simply Clara Kane, a woman who'd fought for her freedom and won, who'd chosen love over fear, who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage was believing you deserved to be happy. The mountains kept their silence, ancient and enduring. But if they could speak, they might tell of other storms weathered, other souls who'd found shelter. For now, they simply stood guard over a small cabin where two hearts had learned to beat as one, where broken things had been mended stronger than before, where love had grown in the most unlikely ground. And in that cabin, as night fell over the Colorado wilderness, Clara and Elijah Kane began the rest of their lives together. Not perfect, not without challenges, but chosen freely and cherished deeply. It was, Clara thought as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, more than enough. It was everything. The town of Mercy's Bend sprawled along the valley like a collection of wooden blocks dropped by a careless child. As Clara and Elijah rode in, Their arrival sparked immediate attention. Curtains twitched, conversations halted mid-sentence, and eyes followed their progress down Main Street with undisguised curiosity. "Steady," Elijah murmured. Sensing Clara's tension, "We knew this wouldn't be easy." They'd come to town for the formal hearing at the county courthouse, but also to face something perhaps more daunting: the judgment of society. News traveled fast in frontier towns, and the story of Clara Dugan, who'd run from her husband and taken up with a mountain hermit, had grown in the telling. At Morrison's general store, Mrs. Patterson stepped out of their way with an audible sniff. "Some women," she said to her companion, loud enough to carry, "don't know their place." Clara's chin lifted, but she kept walking. She'd survived Hank Duggan and a winter storm. She could survive gossip. "Clara!" Sarah Morrison emerged from the store, ignoring Mrs. Patterson's scandalized expression. "I'm so glad you've come. How are you settling in?" "Well, thank you." Clara felt a rush of gratitude for this brave woman who dared public association. "Elijah's been showing me how to read the weather signs. He says I'm a quick study." "I'm sure you are." Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Would you join us for tea tomorrow? Just a few friends." Behind her, Mrs. Patterson made a choking sound. "Sarah Morrison, you cannot be serious." This woman," Sarah interrupted calmly, "survived years of documented abuse and defended herself when attacked. If that offends your sensibilities, Martha, perhaps you should examine why." The courthouse dominated the center of town, its brick facade attempting to project civilization onto the wild frontier. Inside, Clara and Elijah found themselves in a packed courtroom. It seemed half the territory had come to witness the proceedings. Judge Franklin Morehouse, recently arrived from Denver, surveyed the crowd with sharp eyes before calling for order. Unlike Judge Harriman, who'd been in Hank's pocket, Morehouse had a reputation for fairness. "This hearing will determine the legal status of several matters," he began. "The death of Hank Duggan, the validity of the marriage dissolution, and custody of any marital assets." The first witness was Sheriff Watson, who detailed the scene at the cabin, the evidence of the attack, and Clara's clear case of self-defense. Dr. Morrison followed, presenting his medical records with clinical detachment that somehow made them more damning. 3 broken ribs over 2 years, he read. Dislocated shoulder, multiple contusions, lacerations consistent with being struck by objects. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some women nodded knowingly, others looked away, perhaps seeing their own secrets reflected in Clara's public pain. Then came the hostile witnesses. Hank's business partner, Eugene Marsh, painted Clara as unstable, given to wild fancies and female hysteria. She abandoned her lawful husband, Marsh declared, took up with another man while still married. What kind of woman does that? The kind trying to survive. Clara said quietly, but her voice carried. Judge Morehouse looked at her. "You'll have your turn to speak. Mrs." He paused. "How should I address you?" "Clara Kane, Your Honor. Elijah and I were married last month, after my marriage to Hank Duggan was dissolved." More murmurs, some shocked, others approving. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mrs. Kane, continue. Mr. Marsh." But Marsh's testimony fell flat against the mounting evidence. More women came forward. The boarding house owner who'd once sheltered Clara after a beating. The seamstress who'd altered dresses to hide bruises. Even the minister's wife who'd tried to counsel Hank about his drinking. Finally, it was Clara's turn. She stood, smoothing her simple gray dress, and walked to the witness chair with steady steps. "Tell us, in your own words, what happened?" Judge Morehouse instructed. Clara began from the beginning. The arranged marriage, the hope for a new life, the gradual escalation of violence. She spoke clearly, without tears or dramatics, letting the facts speak for themselves. "He said I was property," she concluded. "Bought and paid for, but I am not property. I am a person with the right to safety, dignity, and choice." "And you chose to run." "I chose to live. Your Honor, That night in the storm, I didn't know if I'd survive. I only knew that staying meant a slow death of everything I was. And Mr. Kane. Clara's eyes found Elijah in the crowd. He saved my life, first from the cold, then from the fear. He treated me as an equal, taught me to defend myself, gave me the tools to stand on my own feet. Some would say you moved too quickly from one man to another, the judge observed. Some would say a woman needs a man's protection to survive. Clara replied, I learned differently. I chose Elijah not from need but from want. There's a world of difference. The judge asked about the final confrontation. Clara described it simply. The attack, Elijah being shot, her decision to end the threat permanently. Do you regret killing Hank Duggan? Clara considered the question. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the law couldn't protect me earlier. But I don't regret defending my life and the life of the man I love. When she stepped down, the courtroom was silent. Even Mrs. Patterson seemed subdued. Judge Morehouse's ruling was swift and decisive. The death of Hank Duggan was clearly self-defense. The marriage dissolution stands as valid. As for assets, Mr. Duggan's estate will pay damages to Mrs. Kane for documented injuries sustained during the marriage. Gasps echoed through the room. A judge ordering a husband's estate to pay damages to an abused wife was almost unprecedented. Furthermore, Morehouse continued, let this case serve as notice. The frontier may be wild, but it is not lawless. Women are not chattel. Marriage is not ownership, and violence hiding behind the sanctity of matrimony will find no shelter in my court. As they left the courthouse, Clara found herself surrounded. Some people moved away, but others pressed closer, women mostly, offering quiet words of support or simply touching her arm in solidarity. You did it, one young woman whispered. You got out. Maybe others can too. That evening, in their hotel room, Clara finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. Elijah held her as she trembled, not from fear, but from the release of tension held too long. It's over, he said softly. Truly over. No, Clara corrected. It's just beginning. Did you see their faces? Some of those women. They're trapped too, living their own versions of my story. You can't save them all, Clara. Maybe not, but I can show them it's possible. She pulled back to look at him. Sarah Morrison invited me to tea. It's a start. The tea gathering the next day was indeed a beginning. 7 women attended, defying social pressure. They talked carefully at first, then with increasing openness about their lives, their struggles, their hopes. My Henry's not violent, one admitted. But he controls every penny, every decision. I haven't chosen my own dress in 10 years. Mine drinks, another said quietly. Not mean drunk like Duggan, but absent, like I'm raising the children alone while he's right there. Clara listened more than she spoke, understanding that sometimes being heard was the first step toward healing. When they left, each woman carried something different, a spark of possibility, a seed of courage, or simply the knowledge that they weren't alone. You're starting something, Sarah told Clara as they cleaned up. Change doesn't come easy to places like this, but it comes, one conversation at a time. The final confrontation came as they prepared to leave town. Mrs. Patterson and several other prominent women cornered Clara outside the hotel. You think you're clever, Mrs. Patterson hissed, turning decent women's heads with your radical ideas. But we know what you are, a woman who couldn't keep her husband happy, who chose violence over submission. Clara studied the woman before her, seeing past the anger to the fear beneath. I chose survival over submission, Mrs. Patterson, and I'd make the same choice again. Decent women don't. Decent women. Clara interrupted gently. Shouldn't have to choose between their lives and their marriages. I'm sorry if my story frightens you, but perhaps you should ask yourself why. She walked past them, head high, to where Elijah waited with the horses. As they rode out of Mercy's Bend, Clara looked back once at the town that had witnessed her transformation from victim to survivor. Regrets? Elijah asked. None, Clara said firmly. We planted seeds today. Some will grow, some won't, but the planting matters. They rode home through countryside, awakening to spring. The mountains stood unchanged, but Clara saw them differently now, not as a refuge from the world, but as a foundation from which to help change it. There'll be more women, she said as their cabin came into view. Word will spread. Some will just need to talk. Others might need more. Then we'll help them, Elijah said simply. Together. That night, as they sat before their fire, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd entered Mercy's Bend as a woman on trial. She'd left as a symbol, complicated, controversial, but undeniably powerful. The frontier was changing, one choice at a time. And Clara Kane, who'd once measured her breaths to avoid violence, now breathed freely and helped others find their own air. It was, she thought, the best possible use of a second chance at life. The house stood on a gentle rise at the edge of Mercy's Bend, its fresh-painted white boards gleaming in the afternoon sun. It wasn't large, just 4 rooms and a wraparound porch, but to Clara, it represented everything she'd fought to achieve. The sign hanging by the gate read, Haven House, in her own careful lettering. It's perfect, Elijah said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they surveyed their new property. They'd kept the mountain cabin, but this house in town would serve a different purpose. 6 months had passed since the trial. Word of Clara's story had spread throughout the territory, and with it came letters, dozens of them. Women writing to ask for advice, for hope, for help. Some just needed someone to tell them they weren't crazy for wanting safety. Others needed more. The first one arrives tomorrow, Clara said, leaning into his warmth. Mrs. Garrett from Silver Creek, her letter. She trailed off, remembering the shaky handwriting, the desperate words. We'll help her, Elijah said simply. It had become their shared mission, this work of providing sanctuary. The next morning, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair stood at their door, a small carpet bag clutched in trembling hands. Behind her, 3 children huddled close, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10. Mrs. Kane, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm Helen Garrett. I didn't know where else to go. You came to exactly the right place, Clara said, ushering them inside. You're safe now, over tea and fresh bread. Helen's story emerged in fits and starts. A husband who gambled away their money, who blamed her for his losses, who'd started raising his hand to the children. The final straw had been when he'd struck their youngest. A man can discipline his children, Helen said, as if arguing with voices in her head. That's what everyone says. That's his right. No one has the right to terrorize children, Clara said firmly, or their mothers. You did the right thing leaving. Elijah had taken the children outside, showing them the vegetable garden and the chicken coop. Through the window, Clara could see the youngest boy actually smiling as Elijah let him collect eggs. What happens now? Helen asked. I have no money, no family here. He'll find us. Now you rest, Clara said. You're welcome here as long as you need. As for your husband, there are legal steps we can take. Judge Morehouse is fair, and there's a new lawyer in town who's sympathetic to cases like yours. Over the following weeks, Haven House filled with purpose. Helen and her children settled into routines, the boys helping Elijah with carpentry work, learning skills that might serve them later. The girl, Emma, shadowed Clara, absorbing lessons about more than just cooking and cleaning. A woman should know her worth, Clara told Emma as they worked in the garden. Not in how well she serves others, but in who she is herself. More women came. Some stayed days, others weeks. A few, like Helen, needed longer sanctuary while they rebuilt their lives. Clara and Elijah expanded the house, adding rooms, creating spaces where broken spirits could begin to mend. Sarah Morrison became a regular visitor, bringing medical supplies and checking on the residents. You've created something important here, she told Clara one evening. A place where the unthinkable becomes possible. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Patterson led a delegation of concerned citizens to the house one afternoon, demanding to know why Clara was encouraging wives to abandon their sacred duties. "I'm encouraging women to live without fear," Clara replied, standing firm on her porch while Elijah flanked her, silent but solid. "If that threatens sacred duties, perhaps those duties need examining." "You're destroying families, Mrs." Patterson accused. "Violence destroys families." Clara countered. "I'm offering refuge from the destruction." The confrontation might have escalated, but Judge Morehouse happened to be passing. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "I trust there's no trouble here, Mrs. Kane runs a lawful establishment, providing charitable aid. Very Christian of her, wouldn't you say?" "Mrs." Patterson retreated, but the opposition didn't disappear. There were anonymous threats, dead animals left at the gate, attempts to undermine their work through gossip and lies. But for every enemy, Clara found unexpected allies: the minister who preached about protecting the vulnerable, the banker who quietly extended credit, the shopkeepers who donated goods. One night, as spring turned to summer, Clara woke to find Elijah's side of the bed empty. She found him on the porch, staring at the stars. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Thinking about Mary and Rose," he admitted, wondering what they'd make of all this. Clara took his hand. "I think they'd be proud. You've turned your grief into something that helps others." "We've done that," he corrected. "I couldn't have found this purpose without you." "Nor I without you." She rested her head on his shoulder. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" "We have." He kissed the top of her head. "Though sometimes I miss the quiet of our mountain cabin." "Then let's go," Clara said suddenly. "Just for a few days. Helen can manage the house. She's strong enough now." They left the next morning, riding into the mountains like they had in the early days. The cabin stood unchanged, a testament to where their story began. For 3 days, they lived simply, hunting, cooking over the fire, making love with the abandon of people who'd earned their joy. "I needed this," Clara admitted on their last night, wrapped in blankets before the fire. "To remember where we started. And to remember we're more than our work," Elijah added. "The women we help need us strong, not worn down." They returned to find Haven House bustling. A new arrival, a young woman named Catherine who'd fled a forced marriage, was being settled in by Helen, who'd taken on increasing responsibility. "You've trained her well," Elijah observed, watching Helen's gentle efficiency. "She's trained herself," Clara corrected. "She just needed the chance to show her strength." That evening, as the house settled into quiet, Clara found herself in the kitchen with several of the women, sharing tea and conversation. The talk turned, as it often did, to the future. "What will you do when you leave here?" Catherine asked Helen. "I've been thinking about that." Helen said slowly, Maybe I could help run a place like this. In another town. There's need everywhere." Clara felt a surge of pride. "That's a wonderful idea. We could help you get started." "A network," Sarah Morrison said, having arrived for one of her visits. "Haven houses throughout the territory. Places women know they can turn to." The idea took root that night, growing through animated discussion. By dawn, they had the beginnings of a plan, not just one sanctuary, but many, each one run by women who understood the need because they'd lived it. As summer reached its peak, Clara received a letter that made her hands tremble. It was from Philadelphia, from her father. She hadn't heard from him since leaving for her marriage to Hank. "My dear daughter," it read, "word of your circumstances has reached me. I cannot express my shame at my part in your suffering. If you can forgive an old man's greed and blindness, I would like to help your cause. Your mother would have been proud of your courage." Enclosed was a bank draft, enough to fund several new houses. "Will you forgive him?" Elijah asked when she showed him the letter. "I already have." Clara said, "Holding on to anger only gives the past power over the present, but his money will help women find their own futures." The first anniversary of Clara's flight from Hank brought unexpected celebration. Women from throughout the territory arrived at Haven House. Some she'd helped, others who'd simply drawn strength from her story. They brought food, flowers, and most importantly, their voices. "You showed us we weren't alone," one woman said. "That surviving wasn't shameful. You gave us words for what we couldn't name," said another. That night, as Clara and Elijah sat on their porch watching the sun set over the growing town, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. If someone had told me that night in the storm where I'd be now, I wouldn't have believed them, she said. "Where did you think you'd be?" Elijah asked. "Dead, most likely. Or if I survived, alone and in hiding." She turned to look at him. "I never imagined I'd find love, purpose, a home, family." "Family," Elijah repeated, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. They'd only just confirmed what Clara had suspected, new life growing within her, conceived in love rather than obligation. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "With you? I'm ready for anything." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about all the women who would come to their door seeking sanctuary, all the children who would learn that homes could be places of safety rather than fear. She thought about the network of havens spreading across the frontier, beacons of hope in a harsh land. "We've come so far from that cabin in the snow," she said softly, "and we've got so far yet to go." Elijah replied, "But we'll go together." Clara stood, drawing him up with her. Inside, she could hear voices. Helen reading to the children, other women preparing the evening meal. Their house was full of life, of possibility, of second chances being seized with both hands. "Together," she agreed, leading him inside. The lamplight spilling from Haven House windows cast golden squares on the ground, light pushing back darkness, hope defying despair. And in that light, Clara Kane stood tall, no longer running from her past, but building a future where no woman would have to flee into a killing storm to find her freedom. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in the dramatic moments, the flight through snow, the gunfight, the trial. Sometimes it was in the quiet determination to wake each day and choose compassion over bitterness, love over fear, action over acceptance of the unacceptable. As the door closed behind them, the sign at the gate swayed gently in the evening breeze. Haven House. A simple name for a revolutionary idea that every soul deserved sanctuary, that broken things could be mended stronger than before, that love could grow in the most unlikely ground. And in the Colorado mountains that had witnessed so much pain and triumph, the stars looked down on a world slowly, carefully, courageously being changed, one rescued life at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. I hope Clara and Elijah's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about the story. What did you think about Clara's transformation? Your feedback means everything to us. Until our next adventure in the untamed frontier, keep riding free.